I never thought my life could change in a waiting room. The buzzing fluorescent lights above my head felt like the soundtrack of my existence, cold, sterile, and endlessly humming, just like the nights I spent walking streets I didn't want to walk. I had an appointment with the dentist that day, nothing extraordinary, yet my chest pulsed as if something unseen was about to happen. My hands trembled as I held a cheap handbag that carried nothing but gum and lipstick. But the truth was, it also carried the weight of every secret I never dared to confess. I kept my eyes low, pretending to scroll on my cracked phone screen. Years in the trade had trained me to avoid eye contact. It was safer not to be seen. But then I heard footsteps, firm, measured, confident. And when I glanced up, my eyes met his. A man in his early 30s, dressed simply but with a quiet dignity, as if he carried an invisible light with him. His gaze didn't undress me, didn't judge me, didn't even linger too long. He simply looked at me as though I were human. And for me, that was stranger than any look of desire. My heart jolted. Who was he? Why did his presence feel like warmth seeping through walls I had built so carefully? I forced myself to turn away, but even in that sterile waiting room, with magazines scattered and a television murmuring news no one listened to, something electric lingered in the air. He sat across from me, pulling out a book. Not a phone, not a magazine, but a book. His lips moved ever so slightly as he read, as though whispering words only heaven could hear. I hated myself for staring, yet I couldn't stop. That day, in a dentist's office of all places, my story began to change. I didn't know then that the man across from me wasn't just another stranger. He was a widowed pastor, a man who had lost love and yet carried love still. And me? I was the broken woman about to discover what it meant to be seen, not for my past, but for the possibility of a future. I never thought my life could change in a waiting room. The buzzing fluorescent lights above my head felt like the soundtrack of my existence, cold, sterile, and endlessly humming, just like the nights I spent walking streets I didn't want to walk. I had an appointment with the dentist that day, nothing extraordinary, yet my chest pulsed as if something unseen was about to happen. My hands trembled as I held a cheap handbag that carried nothing but gum and lipstick. But the truth was, it also carried the weight of every secret I never dared to confess. I kept my eyes low, pretending to scroll on my cracked phone screen. Years in the trade had trained me to avoid eye contact. It was safer not to be seen. But then I heard footsteps, firm, measured, confident. And when I glanced up, my eyes met his. A man in his early 30s, dressed simply but with a quiet dignity, as if he carried an invisible light with him. His gaze didn't undress me, didn't judge me, didn't even linger too long. He simply looked at me as though I were human. And for me, that was stranger than any look of desire. My heart jolted. Who was he? Why did his presence feel like warmth seeping through walls I had built so carefully? I forced myself to turn away, but even in that sterile waiting room, with magazines scattered and a television murmuring news no one listened to, something electric lingered in the air. He sat across from me, pulling out a book. Not a phone, not a magazine, but a book. His lips moved ever so slightly as he read, as though whispering words only heaven could hear. I hated myself for staring, yet I couldn't stop. That day, in a dentist's office of all places, my story began to change. I didn't know then that the man across from me wasn't just another stranger. He was a widowed pastor, a man who had lost love and yet carried love still. And me? I was the broken woman about to discover what it meant to be seen, not for my past, but for the possibility of a future. I left the dental practice on a gray London afternoon that smelled like rain and antiseptic. The glass doors whooshed shut behind me, and for a second I just stood there, tasting the metallic echo of the cleaning on my tongue, pretending I had somewhere important to be. The street was a ribbon of headlights and umbrellas. I told myself he was just a passing detail in a day I'd forget. like the hum of the drill or the sting of fluoride. At the reception desk, I'd heard his name when he scheduled a follow-up, Elias Ward. The way the receptionist said it, gentle, like it meant something, pressed a bruise inside me. He was still in the waiting room when I turned to go, book on his knee, thumb marking a page as if he were holding a door open in his heart. I lowered my gaze and slipped out before my courage could ask for more. Halfway down the steps, I realized he'd left the book on the small table beside the chairs. I could have kept walking. People lose things. Other people pretend not to notice. But the thought of those quiet lips moving as he read, praying, maybe, dragged me back through the sliding doors. I picked up the book. It was a worn, dark blue hardcover with a stitched spine. Inside the front cover, a name in looping ink. For Elias, keep the light. H. I ran out into the drizzle, breath fogging, and caught him at the curb where buses coughed and the road hissed. You left this, I said, holding it like contraband. He turned, a warmth in his eyes that didn't flare or devour. It held steady, like the light of a lighthouse, there for anyone, not aimed to burn me. Thank you, he said, voice low, almost surprised. I'd have missed that. I'm Clara, I lied, then realized it wasn't a lie. Clara was my middle name, the one my grandmother had used when she prayed for me over tea and cracked saucers. I hadn't answered to it in years. Clara, he repeated, and it settled over me like a coat that nearly fit. Behind him, a black car idled at the corner. My shoulders tensed. I knew the silhouette even through the wet. An old client's driver, or worse. Are you all right? He asked. My hand had tightened around the strap of my bag so hard my knuckles blanched. I nodded with the practiced smile I'd worn even when everything inside me was screaming. I'm fine, I said, the lie as smooth as gloss. He reached into his pocket and handed me a card. St. Bride's Community Church, Rev. Elias Ward. The gold letters were simple, almost shy. If you ever want someone to talk to, he added. I'm not, I started. He shook his head. No pressure. Just a door that's open. The black car pulled away with a sharp turn, and the tension in my ribs loosened by a fraction. Elias glanced past me, as if he'd felt the air shift too, but he didn't ask. Thank you for the book, he said. It was a gift. I watched the outline of his ring finger. A pale band where a ring had been. Widower. The word hovered between us like breath in cold air. He tucked the book under his arm and stepped into the drizzle, a man walking through weather that couldn't touch the fire he carried inside. Back in my bedsit, the damp climbed the walls like ivy. I kicked off my boots, ignored the blinking red light on my phone announcing unheard messages, and put the card on the table face down. Only then did I notice a thin slip of paper on the floor, curled like a tiny feather. It must have fallen from his book when I picked it up. A note, handwritten in the same looping ink. When the night is long, remember, morning comes. Nothing religious, and yet somehow it breathed. The voicemails were from Mason, 3 of them. You're late. Pick up. 9 p.m., corner of Liverpool Street. Don't make me come looking. The old cold crawled back into my bones. My body remembered how to move when my mind didn't. Shower, makeup, the ritual of armor. But the card on my table, St. Bride's, glowed like a small window left open in a boarded-up house. I pressed the slip of paper to my chest. God, I whispered, feeling ridiculous. If you're real, find me. I put on my coat and walked the long way, past the church just to see it. The doors were shut, but a single amber bulb burned near the side entrance, haloing rain into gold dust. I stood in its spill as if it could disinfect the parts of me I hated. Somewhere inside, I heard a piano. the hesitating kind that belongs to someone relearning their hands after grief. I thought of Elias and the pale band on his finger. I thought of the note. Morning comes. I almost went in. I almost didn't go to Liverpool Street. But a habit can be a leash, and mine yanked hard at 9 o'clock. The man waiting had expensive shoes and no eyes. I fell into the choreography I knew, stepping where the floor was already worn. When my phone buzzed in my coat pocket, I didn't dare look, until the man lit a cigarette and turned away to shield it from the rain. A text from an unknown number. Did you make it home safe? Elias. Home. The word hit like a bell. The man exhaled smoke, arrogant and bored. My past stood on one side of me with its cold hand on my shoulder. On the other, a card that said a door was open, and a message that used a word I hadn't believed in for years. I slid the phone back into my pocket and lifted my chin. God, I breathed into the rain. Hold me. Then the man turned, and the night snapped tight like a trap. The night after Liverpool Street left, bruises no one could see. My body carried on, painted and practiced, but my soul throbbed with the weight of choices I couldn't seem to escape. When I finally stumbled back to my bedsit at dawn, I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the card on the table. St. Bride's Community Church, Rev. Elias Ward. The letters looked like they belonged to another life, one I had no right to touch. For 3 days I avoided the church. I avoided him. But his text replayed in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. Did you make it home safe? Men didn't ask me that. They asked how much, how long, how far. They didn't care if I arrived safely anywhere. Yet here was this stranger, this widower with soft eyes and a book in his hands, caring about the one thing no one had ever cared about, whether I survived the night. On the 4th day, curiosity or desperation, or maybe something greater, pulled me down the cobblestone street to St. Bride's. The doors were heavy oak, their hinges groaning as though the building itself questioned my entrance. Inside, the air smelled of wax and wood polish. Candles flickered at the altar, their flames bending as if bowing. I slipped into the last pew, keeping my head low. My heart beat so violently I thought someone would hear it echo. Elias was at the piano, alone. His fingers stumbled over notes, hesitating, as though relearning a language he'd once spoken fluently. I didn't know music, but I knew grief. Every pause between the chords sounded like silence between sobs. He didn't see me, and I didn't want him to. Watching him play was like watching someone bleed, but with dignity. For a second, I almost envied his pain. It was honest. It wasn't disguised like mine. A creak in the pew betrayed me. Elias looked up, startled. When his eyes found me in the shadows, he didn't frown, didn't ask why I was there. Instead, he stood, smoothing his shirt nervously. Clara. My name in his voice sounded like an invitation, not an accusation. I gripped the edge of the pew. I shouldn't be here. You're welcome here, he said simply, walking closer. His gaze held no fire of curiosity, no judgment, just presence. He sat in the pew ahead of me, leaving a safe distance, and folded his hands. I usually come here when I can't sleep, he admitted. Helps me feel less haunted. The word cracked gently, revealing more of him than I expected. I wanted to laugh, or cry, or both. Haunted. That was my entire existence. Haunted by faces, by touches, by choices. But I didn't speak. My throat locked, my chest tight. He must have sensed it, because after a moment he reached into his pocket and pulled out the slip of paper I had returned with his book. That note you found, he said. It was from my wife. Before she... His voice caught. He pressed the paper flat with his thumb. It's the last thing she wrote to me. I keep it close. It reminds me that even the longest nights don't last forever. Something inside me cracked. His wife's words, "Morning comes," weren't just for him. They pressed against my own scars like a balm I didn't think I deserved. Tears blurred my vision, hot and stubborn. I turned my face away, but he noticed. "Clara," he said softly, "you don't have to carry what you carry alone." The urge to confess, to vomit out the ugliness of my life, rose like fire, but fear choked it down. He didn't know who I was, what I did, what I'd done. If he found out, would that lighthouse gaze dim? Would he look at me the way every other man did, one way or another? My voice shook. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," he said. And in that moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe someone could stand in the rubble of who I was and not run. But the sound of footsteps in the vestibule broke the moment. A shadow moved. Tall, familiar, dangerous. Mason. My stomach clenched. He had followed me. I shot up from the pew, panic flooding me. Elias rose too, confusion clouding his face. "What's wrong?" he asked. I shook my head violently, whispering, "I have to go." Mason's voice echoed, low and sharp, from the back of the church. "Clara." My blood froze. The sanctuary, once safe, now felt like a trap. I fled past Elias, my shoulder brushing his hand, and bolted into the rain. Behind me, I heard Elias call my name. But ahead, Mason's figure loomed like a shadow I could never outrun. And deep inside, a war began. The pull of the past that owned me, and the fragile spark of a future I wasn't sure I deserved. Rain drenched my coat as I ran, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside me. Mason's voice still echoed like a chain rattling at my ankles. I turned corners blindly until my lungs burned, finally collapsing under an awning outside a shuttered cafe. My hands shook so violently I dropped my phone into a puddle. For a moment, I just let it sink, watching the ripples swallow it, as if part of my old life could drown there. But Mason wasn't water. He was fire. And fire always found me. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I took the longest route I could find, looping around neighborhoods where no one knew me. By dawn, exhaustion dragged me back to my bedsit. The church card still lay on the table where I'd left it, edges curling from the damp. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I traced the letters with my fingertip like a secret prayer. A door that's open. But doors, in my life, had always led to cages. The following evening, I gathered courage I didn't own and returned to St. Bride's. My hair still smelled of cigarette smoke from the night before, and shame clung to me like perfume. I half expected Elias to be waiting with questions, or worse, with pity. But when I pushed the door open, the sanctuary was empty, except for him at the piano again. He didn't look up immediately. When he finally did, his smile was small, hesitant, but real. "You came back." I wanted to disappear. My voice was brittle when I said, "I shouldn't be here." He closed the piano gently, the final chord lingering like a sigh. "Clara," he said, "sometimes the places we think we don't belong are the very places meant to heal us." His words struck something buried deep, and I hated that they did. I slid into the last pew, unable to move closer, afraid of what he might see if I let him. Silence stretched between us, heavy but not suffocating. At last, I whispered, "That man. At the church yesterday. He isn't safe." The admission slipped out like blood from a cut I couldn't bandage fast enough. Elias's eyes sharpened, not with judgment, but with concern. "Do you need help?" The question was dangerous. I had lived my life refusing help, because help always came with chains. But Elias's tone was different, steady, gentle, like he was offering me a hand instead of a leash. My throat tightened. "No one can help me," I muttered, standing abruptly. But as I turned to leave, he said something that froze me mid-step. God can. The words pierced me. Not because I believed them, but because part of me desperately wanted to. I looked back, my vision blurring with unshed tears. If he can, I whispered, then why hasn't he? Elias stood but didn't come closer. Sometimes, he said softly, he waits until we're ready to open the door. That night, I didn't return to Liverpool Street. Mason's messages multiplied, sharp, demanding, threatening. I silenced the phone, my heart pounding with every buzz. For the first time in years, I disobeyed. I curled on my mattress, clutching Elias's note. Morning comes to my chest. The fear was still there, yes, but so was a fragile thread of defiance I didn't know I possessed. Days passed. Each one, I found myself drifting back to St. Bride's, drawn by something I couldn't name. Elias never pressed me with questions. He talked about music, about rebuilding the community after the pandemic, about the loneliness of grief. Slowly, piece by piece, he handed me fragments of his heart, and I found myself holding them with trembling hands. I still hadn't confessed the truth of my life, but for the first time, I wanted to. Then one evening, as candles flickered and the piano's hesitant notes filled the sanctuary, the heavy wooden doors burst open. Mason stepped inside, his eyes locking on me with the fury of a storm. My body froze, the fragile safety I'd begun to build shattering instantly. Elias rose, instinctively placing himself between us. And in that terrifying moment, I realized two things. Mason wasn't going to let me go without a fight, and Elias wasn't going to let me face him alone. The sanctuary walls seemed to close in as Mason's boots echoed against the stone floor. My pulse thundered in my ears. I had seen him angry before, but this was different. His rage had a focus now, and that focus was me. Elias stood firm, shoulders squared, his presence suddenly larger than his frame. "She's not yours to follow," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the church like a shield. Mason smirked, but his eyes were knives. "And who are you, preacher? Another savior trying to polish what can't be cleaned?" My stomach twisted. Every word was a blade reminding me of what I was. I wanted to shrink, to vanish into the pews, but Elias didn't move. He stood like a wall between us, calm but unyielding. "Mason, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Don't do this here." My plea only fanned the flames. "You belong where I put you," he snarled. "Don't forget who pays for your silence, Clara." His words struck with venom, and the air seemed to vanish from my lungs. My secret life, the one I'd kept buried from Elias, spilled into the open without my consent. Elias didn't flinch. He turned, just enough for his gaze to meet mine. In his eyes I expected disgust, maybe even horror. Instead, I found something else. Grief? Yes, but also compassion that made me ache. He looked at me as though my shame was not the whole of me. That gaze nearly undid me. "Mason," Elias said, his voice steady. "This ends tonight. Whatever hold you think you have over her, it's finished." Mason laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that bounced off the vaulted ceiling. "You think you can rewrite her story? She's filth, always will be." The words sliced me open, but before I could crumble, Elias stepped forward. "No one is beyond redemption," he said, his tone fierce with quiet authority. I wanted to scream, to beg him not to fight this battle for me, but my voice caught in my throat. Mason advanced, hand twitching like he wanted to strike. Instinct made me rush forward, placing myself between them. "Stop," I cried. "Please, just stop." My hands shook as they pressed against Elias's chest, holding him back. I turned to Mason, tears streaking my face. "You don't own me anymore." The words shocked even me. They rang out in the sacred space like a confession and a declaration all at once. Mason's face hardened, his jaw tight with fury. For a moment I thought he would hit me. But something, maybe the weight of the place, maybe the immovable calm in Elias's eyes, made him falter. With a curse, he shoved past me, the door slamming behind him so hard the candles flickered out. Silence fell, thick and trembling. My knees buckled, and Elias caught me before I hit the ground. His arms were strong but gentle, the first safe place I'd known in years. "It's over," he whispered, though we both knew it wasn't. Not entirely. My sobs tore free, messy and unrestrained, staining his shirt with every unspoken wound. And for the first time, I didn't apologize for breaking down. When I finally pulled back, his gaze searched mine. "Clara, I don't care what you've done. I don't care where you've been. You are not what he says you are." His words dug deeper than Mason's ever could. They terrified me and healed me at once. But my shame still clawed. "You don't understand," I choked. "If you knew the whole truth." He touched my hand, steadying it in his. "Then tell me," he said softly, "and let me see you, not the scars." I wanted to. Oh God, I wanted to. But my lips trembled, the confession locked inside like a prisoner begging for release. Instead, I whispered the only prayer I knew. "God, please, don't let me run this time." That night, as Elias walked me home beneath the drizzle, I felt the tension of two worlds pulling me apart. The one I had lived in too long, and the one I could almost believe was waiting. The suspense of which would win pressed against my ribs like a ticking clock. And in my heart, a terrifying question bloomed. Could love, real love, survive the truth of who I was? The morning after Mason stormed out of the church, I expected the fear to return stronger. Instead, I woke to silence. Not the hollow silence of loneliness, but something gentler, like the pause between heartbeats. Elias's words from the night before still echoed, "You are not what he says you are." I carried them like armor, though doubt still gnawed at the edges. I avoided my phone all day, ignoring the barrage of messages from Mason. But when I finally switched it on, there was a voicemail unlike the others, calm, chilling. "You think you're free, Clara? We'll see how long your preacher boy keeps looking at you the same way." My stomach nodded. Mason wasn't finished, yet for the first time I didn't feel completely defenseless. I had Elias. That evening, I returned to St. Bride's. The sanctuary was dim, candles burning low, shadows dancing across the pews. Elias stood at the front, speaking with a few parishioners. When his eyes found me, they lit with something that felt dangerously like joy. He excused himself and walked over, his steps quick but measured. "You came," he said softly, as though he'd been holding his breath all day. I wanted to tell him everything right there. The streets, the men, the years I had sold pieces of myself to survive. But before I could, the heavy doors banged open. Mason again. My heart seized. This time, though, Elias didn't waver. He moved in front of me instinctively, his voice firm. "Enough." Mason sneered, but before he could speak, 2 officers entered behind him. My breath caught. Elias had reported him. He hadn't just prayed, he had acted. Mason cursed, fought, but the officers restrained him, his fury echoing uselessly in the sacred space. As they dragged him away, his voice faded into the night, leaving only silence. I stood frozen, trembling, until Elias turned to me. "You're safe now," he said. And for the first time, I believed it. The dam inside me broke. Words tumbled out between sobs. I told him everything. The nights, the shame, the choices, the chains. I braced for his face to harden, for the lighthouse in his eyes to dim. But he only stepped closer, cupping my face in his hands. Clara, he whispered, you're not defined by your past. You are loved. You are free. Something in me shattered and healed all at once. His arms wrapped around me, strong and certain, as though holding me together while I learned how to breathe again. It wasn't just comfort. It was home. The sanctuary glowed with the flicker of candlelight, and in that moment, it felt like heaven itself bent low enough to touch me. Weeks turned into months. The whispers of the past still tried to haunt me, but they lost their power in the light of Elias's steady love. He walked with me through every shadow, never rushing, never flinching. Slowly, I began to dream of a future I'd thought forever lost, one filled with laughter, dinners for two, and maybe one day, children who would never know the chains I'd once worn. On a spring morning, beneath blossoms that fell like confetti, Elias took my trembling hands in his. Clara, he said, voice thick with hope, will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you what love really means? My heart, once a prison, opened like a window. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, yes. And for the first time, the word didn't feel borrowed. It was mine. When his lips touched mine, soft and reverent, the world stilled. All the scars, all the nights, all the shadows, none of them defined me anymore. I wasn't the woman Mason had named. I wasn't the ghost of my past. I was Clara Ward, beloved, chosen, redeemed. And as his arms encircled me beneath the shower of blossoms, I realized the truth of his wife's last words, the ones that had carried him through grief and had now carried me through shame. Morning comes. And when it did, it came brighter, sweeter, and filled with love I had once believed I could never deserve. Looking back, it feels almost impossible that my story began in a dentist's waiting room. A place so ordinary became the threshold of everything extraordinary. I thought I was beyond rescue, beyond love, beyond family, but grace has a way of finding you in the most unexpected corners, even when you're convinced you're too far gone. I still carry the scars of my past, but Elias never sees them as stains. He calls them proof of survival, reminders that light can break through even the deepest night. And slowly, I've come to believe him. Every morning, when I wake beside the man who chose to see me not for who I was, but for who I could become, I whisper a prayer of gratitude. It's not polished or perfect, but it's real. Thank you for the morning. Because morning did come, and it came wrapped in love, laughter, and the soft warmth of a family I never thought I'd have. My story isn't about where I've been. It's about where I'm going, hand in hand with a man who once played broken notes on a piano and now plays joy in the chambers of my heart. Redemption is real, and so is love. The house was filled with laughter, the kind that spills from every room and lingers like perfume in the air. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like golden confetti. In the garden, 2 children chased each other between rose bushes, their squeals echoing like music. I stood at the kitchen doorway, my heart swelling with a joy so fierce it almost frightened me. 5 years ago, I never would have believed this life could be mine. Elias came in from the yard, sleeves rolled up, hair dusted with flour from the bread he'd been kneading with our daughter. He kissed my forehead as though it were the most natural ritual in the world. And it was. This was our rhythm now. Love woven into the small details, 1,000 tiny miracles stitched into ordinary days. And yet, none of it was ordinary. Not to me. Every smile, every meal, every bedtime prayer with little voices whispering Amen. It was all evidence of a grace that had rewritten my story. Communion with Christ had been the thread holding me steady, pulling me out of the shadows and into a light I hadn't known existed. I learned to lay down shame, not because I earned the right to, but because love, divine love, had already paid the price. Sometimes I still remembered the streets, the cold nights, the the faces blurred by time. But they no longer haunted me. They were chapters of a book whose ending had been utterly transformed. My life was no fairy tale. It was something far better. It was a redemption story. And as I watched my children run into their father's arms, I whispered the quiet prayer that had become the soundtrack of my life. Thank you, Lord, for the morning that never ends.